Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar, which supports the new A-level Latin set text cycle. Today, we're going to be thinking about book 4 of Virgil's Aeneid, and I'll shortly hand over to our two wonderful presenters. But firstly, just a few reminders. As you just heard, we are recording this webinar, and it will be available within the next couple of weeks on both the Classical Association and Bloomsbury websites. Thank you to those of you that have submitted questions in advance. We have tried to factor these into the planning of today's webinar, but do feel free to ask questions throughout today's session. You can put these into the chat, which I'll be monitoring, but there'll also be opportunity to unmute and speak directly to the presenters at the end of each of their presentations if you would like to. And we would really encourage you to ask as many questions as you'd like. I should note that whilst we will be discussing the specifics of the exam, we are not the voice of Cambridge OCR, and so please do contact the exam board directly if you feel that you need further advice on the exam. We do have representatives from Bloomsbury Publishing on the call, so if you have any queries related to the commentaries themselves, again, do drop a question into the chat and we will endeavour to respond to that as soon as we can. So I'm going to hand over then to our two presenters. We're going to hear from Dr. Fiachra Mac Góráin, Associate Professor at UCL, whose research and publications focus on Virgil, Latin literature and its reception. And we'll also hear from Katharine Radice, an experienced teacher and regular author of OCR endorsed Bloomsbury set text editions and the De Romanis Latin course. Fiachra, over to you.
Thank you very much, Grania, and thank you for inviting me, and hello to all the teachers, and it's very nice to be here. Catherine and Grania and I met briefly yesterday to think a little bit about what we might say today, and we all agreed that an overview is often very important for grounding an interpretation of an individual passage or of an individual line. So I thought that I would start with a few remarks about book 4 as a whole. How it fits into the Aeneid and some sort of broad brushstrokes points about it. So if I could just say a few words about its position in the 12-book Aeneid. There are various ways of carving up the Aeneid to yield meaning, and one way of thinking about it is as 3 sets of 4 books, where the first set, books 1 to 4, is based in Carthage and dominated by Dido. And of course, within that, we have the inset narrative of Aeneas's after-dinner speech with the fall of Troy in book 2 and the wanderings in book 3. But books 1 and 4, as part of that, then really very dominated by the presence of Dido, the coming together of Dido and Aeneas in book 1, and their affair and separation in book 4. So that's one cluster of 4 books. This is matched really by books 9 to 12, which are the battle books of the Aeneid. And Turnus and Dido are the 2 great tragic characters of the Aeneid in a lot of ways, and they mirror each other in that they're the great opponents and antagonists of the Roman mission. Dido, the Carthaginian one, and Aeneas and Turnus, the Italian one. And at the beginning of book 12, in a simile, Turnus is compared with not only a wounded lion, but a wounded lion in Punic fields, so a wounded Punic lion. So Virgil is often encouraging us to think about similarities and correspondences between Dido and Turnus. And then, of course, in the middle, we have the panel of Italian and Roman books, where book 5 is set in Sicily, book 6 is Cuma and the Sibyl and the Underworld, book 7 is when they go up the River Tiber and they have their initial encounters with the Latins, with Latinus, and of course the embassy, and that turns sour when Juno makes the war break out. And then in book 8, Aeneas goes to Palantium and secures the alliance with Evander and the Arcadians. So those would be sort of the middle cluster of 4 books, where they're sort of getting a foothold in Italy. So it makes sense to think of book 4 as part of a 4-book cluster that is in dialogue with 2 other 4-book clusters that structure the epic. There are a lot of links between book 4 and book 1. At the end of book one, Dido invites Aeneas to tell the story of the Trojan War. And that takes us, as I've said, through books two and three. And then at the beginning of book four, Dido is properly in love with Aeneas, partly because of the spellbinding narrative that she has heard. There are various other ways in which the books are in dialogue with each other. It isn't really possible to understand the love story of Dido and Aeneas without thinking of the uh, divine machinations that we see throughout Book One. So Jupiter sends down Mercury about a third of the way through Book One to soften the hearts of the Carthaginians so that they're receptive and welcoming to the Trojans. And then in the closing sequence of Book One, Venus and Cupid sort of combine their forces, and Cupid is metamorphosed into Ascanius and sits on Dido's lap and infatuates her with an almost physical kind of poison so that she falls in love with Aeneas. And this is really very important for ethical reasons and for how we judge Dido. And obviously, we judge her, she's depicted very sympathetically, but she isn't completely in control of her own emotions and her own decisions. And it's important to have a sense of what happens in book one in order to appreciate that. A couple more points from book one, which is that we have a couple of theatrical references in book one. When the Trojans make landfall in the Carthaginian harbour, the backdrop of the harbour is referred to with the word skyna, which means backdrop, and it's very interesting to look at how different English translations render that. But skyna obviously is a word that refers to the backcloth of a stage. And then when Aeneas sees various buildings springing up in Carthage, he sees a forum and he sees the Temple of Juno, but he also sees the foundations of a theatre being laid. So it's all, and Virgil has the phrase "scinis decora apta futuris," these fundamenta which are suitable for the stage shows that are to come. So that might be a reference to the theatrical content of Book Four that's yet to come. And then finally, in Book One, line 337, when Venus is disguised as a hunting as a huntress, as a Spartan huntress, she's wearing cothurnoi, and she says that it's the custom of Tyrian maidens to wear cothurnoi. But in fact, the cothurnoi are what tragic actors on the Athenian stage wear. And often in Greek as well as in Latin, we have it in Aristophanes' Frogs, we have it in Ovid's Amores. The word cothurnus is sort of a byword for tragedy and the tragic actor. So a lot of tragedy has been set up in Book One already. Turning now to Book Four itself, one of the most interesting things about Book Four is how little of the plot is really devoted to a happy love story. Presumably they were happy at the banquet, and when Dido is, if you like, lovesick at the beginning of the book, and she's forgetting her duties, and then when Iarbas is annoyed that Dido and Aeneas are spending the winter, making love with one another, presumably they're quite happy for a short spell. But really, we're only a third of the way into the book when Mercury is sent down by Jupiter to Aeneas and tells him that he needs to leave. And the middle part of the book is dominated, I suppose, by the quarrel, or in tragic terms, the agon between Dido and Aeneas. And then the third of the book is a sort of a descent into hell, or a sort of a descent into the very kind of grotesque and gruesome sequence leading to Dido's decision to end her own life, and then obviously her suicide at the end. So the book really is in three parts, and Kenneth Quinn points out in his analysis of the Aeneid, in his book, The Virgil's Aeneid, A Critical Description, 1983, that the phrase "at regina, but the queen" occurs three times in the book, lines 1, line 296, and line 504. And we might think of this almost as three acts in a drama. The book is very formally structured, almost like a play. And a German scholar in the 1970s, Antoni Vlasák, went so far as to posit a five-act division, which she described using the Aristotelian terminology used in the Poetics to describe the structure of a tragedy with Dexis and Eleusis and Peripeteia and Anagnorisis and so on and so forth. And you might quibble with some of those divisions, but it's clearly very tragic in structure in some ways. So I'll come back to tragedy in just a moment, but Virgil is first and foremost very, very, very Homeric, and there are various ways in which Dido is a Homeric kind of a character. Um, in the Odyssey, Aeneas is trying to make his way back to his wife. Sorry, in the Odyssey, Odysseus is trying to make his way back to Penelope, who is the wife with whom he is to be reunited. In the Aeneid, the role of Penelope is sort of divided, as often happens with Homeric material in Virgil, between Lavinia, who is the wife in waiting in Italy, and Dido has some of Penelope's qualities as well because she does weaving. And one wonders whether Dido weaves so that she can be a little bit more like Penelope, so that she can be a little bit more wifely or more attractive in that optic to Aeneas. It's just sort of a flickering moment, really. As a queen who rules, Dido is also like Arete, the wife of Alcinous. But really, the two Homeric characters that she's most like are Circe and Calypso, or perhaps I should say Calypso and Circe, because these are the two sorceress goddess characters who detain the hero from his ultimate destination in the Odyssey. And you could say that Carthage fulfills the function in some ways of the island of Calypso because Aeneas is disporting himself there, having a very nice time there, and having, presumably a sexual relationship with this female figure. And then in the closing third of the book, when Dido is engaging in witchy rituals and sacrifices, it would be appropriate to think of her as quite like Circe from the Odyssey. Maybe a very slight hint of Nausicaa as well, although Nausicaa is a very different kind of character um, from Dido. Um, it's interesting how the relationship with Calypso is brought to an end in the Odyssey. Hermes comes down and speaks to Calypso directly, so there's a sort of decorum there where her pride is saved. Whereas in the Aeneid, what happens is that Mercury comes down to Aeneas, and it's a different kind of approach. So, as always with Homer, there's a dialogue between sameness and difference. Um, in the Aeneid, there's also the other factor that Aeneas is being told very explicitly that he needs to go and found Rome. So Jupiter has this on his radar, and it's very explicit in the message that's carried down by Hermes. And we don't have anything really quite equivalent in the Odyssey. It's simply a matter of Odysseus' own personal choice and personal agency. And he has the option of becoming a god and spending, days immortal and immemorial with Calypso, but he chooses humanity and he chooses to be reunited with Penelope. So that contrast, I think, is quite interesting. Now, always in Virgil, there are multiple literary models in play, and part of the thing that we have to bear in mind with Dido is that how we react to her or how we interpret her at any given moment will tend to depend on which literary model is dominant, perhaps in that sequence of the book or of the story. And there can obviously be more than one in view at any given time, and we might imagine one as bobbing up and down, or another one as taking its place, or two being sort of interlaced or interwoven or something like that. Um, so I'll just say a few words now about the tragic models that Dido has, as well as the Homeric models. Um, well, one very explicit moment in the in book four at 469 and following is that Dido in a simile is compared with Pentheus, and it's very like Pentheus in the Bacchae because he's seeing twin suns and two sets of Thebes. And also Orestes, but not only Orestes as the mythical figure, but the phrase is Scinis agitatus Orestes, Orestes who's being dragged across the stage. So a little bit like the references to Scylla and theatre in book one, it is a very explicit reference to theatre and drama and actually production and acting. So it's a sort of a literary signal or a nod on the part of the poet to the readers that tragedy is being engaged with and invoked here in sort of very specifically generic terms, if I can put it like that. Another very tragic moment is the way that Virgil uses the word culpa, which is several times in book four. And Perhaps the most prominent of these is after the wedding, or the, quote unquote wedding in the cave, and we can talk a little bit about what happens in the cave. But we're told that after the wedding, that Dido calls their relationship a marriage. So conjugium vocat hoc praetexit nomine culpam. And with this name, she covers over her culpa. And we don't really know whether or not Virgil was reading Aristotle's Poetics, or whether Aristotle's Poetics was in circulation at the time that Virgil was writing. There isn't any specific evidence in that direction, but it's possible that some of the ideas from Aristotle's Poetics were circulating through other channels, perhaps through the Hellenistic handbook tradition, or in literary critical circles. But culpa in Latin is very close in meaning to hamartia in Aristotle's Poetics. So it's quite possible that Virgil is alluding to tragedy in general ways, in specific ways, but also through this literary critical channel, if I can put it like that, and that he's alluding to Aristotle's Poetics as well. And if he is, then that's really quite interesting, and an enrichment, and another level, if you like, of the illusion. Um, when we start at the beginning of, well, maybe I should go back to the end of book one. When Dido is being maddened and duped into falling in love with Aeneas at the end of book one, we get a little flicker there, even though the dynamics aren't exactly the same, of what happens to Phaedra in Euripides' Hippolytus. When book four opens, then we have a scene at dawn where we have two sisters, Dido and Anna, talking in the palace, presumably, but one of the things they're talking about is the spilling of kindred blood. Sparsos fraterna caede penates is one of the phrases there. Now, penates obviously is a very Roman, very Latin word, but really it's quite like the conversation between Antigone and Ismene at the beginning of Sophocles' Antigone, which is obviously a civil war play. And Virgil often uses Theban myth in the Aeneid when he's reflecting on things relating to civil war. So we're sort of primed to think of Dido as an Antigone figure at the very beginning of the book, and that might encourage us to think of her as defiant, of standing against strong men. But it also raises the question of whether there's a kind of an intertextual determinism here, that she's going to come to a difficult end, maybe not achieve the marriage that she might have wished to achieve, or not become a mother in the way that Antigone might have wished to become a mother. So this really is part of how Virgilian intertextuality works. It dangles a figure in front of the reader, and it prompts a sort of a compare and contrast exercise in the mind of the reader, where the reader wonders, well, how far can this model be pushed? Does it have merely local significance, or might it actually be relevant in a more thoroughgoing way? Then, as the conversation between Dido and Anna continues, reference is made to Dido's pudor, her shame, and we have this phrase "solvitque pudorem," and this takes us really into the territory of Hippolytus again, because the nurse in Hippolytus was trying to draw out Phaedra and wanted her to dispense with her idos, her shame, and loosen her idos, and sort of give in to the enjoyments of love and so on. Um, in the middle section of Book Four, when the quarrel takes place between Dido and Aeneas, the terms of that quarrel really are the services that Dido has rendered to Aeneas, and the thanklessness and faithlessness of Aeneas, in that he is abandoning her. And the bells that would probably be ringing for the educated reader at that point would probably be the Medea story. And that would be a combination of multiple versions of the Medea story, primarily maybe Euripides' Medea, we think, but also Apollonius's Medea from the Argonautica, and quite probably the Medea of Ennius, and who knows how many other versions. There's an essay by Matthew Wright, Making Medea Medea, in a new book on fragmentary Greek tragedy, edited by Patrick Finglas and Lindsay Koo. And he has 40 different Medeas from the Greek and Roman tradition in play there. So Virgil will presumably have been engaging with any number of them, and not just Euripides. Um, so again, one of the questions with Jason and Medea is, if Euripides is in the background, how far do we push that analogy? And at one point, at the end of her first speech to Aeneas, Dido says, "If only I could have had a child by you, who would, in spite of all, who would play in my halls, and who, in spite of all, would remind me of you through facial resemblance. Qui te tamen ore referat is the Latin, I wouldn't think that I was utterly capta ac deserta, utterly sort of beaten and deserted. And if you're thinking of Dido as a Medea-like figure, then this is really quite a chilling moment because, of course, it is precisely the children that Medea uses, weaponizes, if you like, to get back at Jason. And one of the questions that came through earlier was to do with the reception of Dido, and one of the important receptions of Dido is the seventh letter in Ovid's Heroides collection. And in that poem, at I think it's line 133, 134, one of the things that Dido writes in the letter to Aeneas is, well, I might actually be pregnant, and you might be leaving part of your body behind as you desert me, clausa enclosed in my body. So Ovid, always a very alert reader of Virgil, has seen that potentiality in the Aeneid, and he's kind of taken it a step further. And it's quite unusual for two regal figures to have a sexual relationship, but not to have a child. Whenever a god mates with a human, there's always issue. And this is very important in the Aeneid because the Aeneid is a poem of genealogical succession. So he has a Trojan wife, he has a Carthaginian sort of quasi-wife, and then he has the Italian wife as well. And if when she killed herself, the Carthaginian wife was pregnant, then that actually the stakes are quite high, and that has some implications for how we read Aeneas, if you like, as a responsible father figure. So there's more that could be said about tragic characters, but I'll move on from that. Alcestis is another model, Deianira is another model, Cassandra is another model, but maybe if there are questions, we can talk more about the detail of that. I want to just talk about two more areas. One is the question of historical context. And as Catherine pointed out yesterday in our preliminary chat, it's quite possible to read the story of Dido in books one and four, and for the most part, not to think particularly of any historical referentiality. But if you go a little bit below the surface, it becomes quite clear that there are two main historical contexts that she's evoking. And one of these really is the Punic Wars, and the Gauls who sacked Rome, and the Carthaginians who marched on Rome. And if you think of Hannibal crossing the Alps with his elephants in the Second Punic War, they were the two greatest enemies that most sort of put the fear of God into the Romans, if I can put it like that. And Virgil is doing a very courageous thing in having this extremely sympathetic character, Dido. Well, of course, she's a mixed character. She's a mixture of being sympathetically drawn and actually being, quite edgy and dangerous and vindictive. But at least we have the idea that there's a potentiality of there having been a good relationship between them, and that then went sour when Aeneas was mandated to leave. And that's maybe the last point I want to talk about, the whole question of their marriage. But in her final speech, one of the things that Dido does is she calls down an avenger, and this is line 625, I think, exoriar aliquis nostris ex ossibus ultor, arise avenger from my bones, who will weary or who will harry the Trojans with sort of fire and with weapons and so on, and let there be no love and let there be no contracts or treaties between our two peoples, and let us be sort of perpetually at variance with one another. And this is like Cassandra in Aeschylus's Agamemnon when she prophesies that Orestes is going to come and avenge her. So there's a sort of a tragic background, but the obvious historical reference there is Hannibal and indeed the Punic Wars and the enmity between Rome and Carthage. So there's a Homeric level, there's a tragic level, and then there's this Punic Wars Carthaginian level that Virgil is very daringly entering in upon. Um, he probably wasn't inventing that because we have a reference to Dido in one fragment of Naevius's Bellum Punicum or Punic War, which is an earlier Latin epic that Virgil may well have been quite influenced by, and it seems to have mixed myth and history. Of course, from a historical point of view, the idea that Aeneas had an affair with Dido is really very unlikely because our historical date for the founding of Carthage is a ninth century date, and our date for the Trojan War is basically a 12th century date. So, Carthage wasn't being founded at the time that these refugees were crossing the Mediterranean, but why let historical fact get in the way of a good story? Um, The second important historical context that's constantly being evoked in the Aeneid is really the recent histories of the civil wars. And in the affair between Aeneas and Dido, there's a strong historical echo of the relationship between Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Particularly at that moment when Aeneas is wearing purple and a jasper studded sword and a purple cloak that Dido has woven. And the scenario is really very like the scenario that's described by Plutarch and the historians of Mark Antony having been, seduced and led astray and maybe unmanned and de-Romanized by Cleopatra when he was in the East in Ephesus and indeed in Egypt in Alexandria. Um, and there are some structural similarities between them as well, such as, for example, both Dido and Cleopatra having a menacing brother and being solo queens. And the scholarship, I would refer you to a book by Elena Justi, Carthage and Virgil's Aeneid, Staging the Enemy under Augustus, where she goes through all of the various historical echoes in the Dido episode. And she's also preparing a book for Bloomsbury, actually, on Dido, which I hope will be out before too long. So, Aeneas, often in the Aeneid, is thought of as analogous to the Emperor Augustus. And when Ronald Syme wrote The Roman Revolution in 1939, that book contained the sentence, "The poem is not an allegory, but no contemporary reader could fail to detect a foreshadowing of the Emperor Augustus." In the character Aeneas. So most of the time with his pietas, we think of Aeneas as the Augustus-like character, but here in Book Four, he sort of swerves from his duty to found Rome, and he becomes more like a Mark Antony character seduced by this Eastern queen. So Dido as Cleopatra and Dido as heralding the Punic Wars. This is important historical context. Um, the last area that I'd like to talk about in this opening pitch really is the whole question of the marriage. And one of the things that's quite interesting about a lot of scenes in the Aeneid is that many contentions don't have the authorial stamp. That is to say, they're not told from an objective point of view. They're really related in a subjective way. And this is the case in drama as well, where every character has their own distinct point of view. And I was just reading something about Tom Stoppard. Yesterday, we have a doctoral student working on Tom Stoppard, and he talks about how he likes writing drama because you can state your opinion and then you can contradict your own opinion with reason. And obviously, the dialogue between Aeneas and Dido, or the confrontation between Aeneas and Dido, is one of two, fairly irreconcilable points of view. So, if we look at what the nature of their relationship was, Juno and Venus together machinate to bring about some sort of a wedding between them. And we have a lot of wedding vocabulary in that scene in the cave, where we have the chorus of the nymphs, and we have pro nuba Juno, so Juno, who is in her capacity as, goddess of marriages. We have the sacrifices leading up to it, and Dido, together with Anna, sacrifices to various gods, but also Junoni Antomnis, above all to Juno, cui vincula Eugalia curai, who has, as a care, marriage bonds. And that might be about dissolving the duty to her former husband, Sychaeus, who's obviously dead, and paving the way for a new marriage in Aeneas. And when Dido comes to Aeneas in book four, after rumor has reached her, she begs him per connubia nostra, per inceptos hymenaios, by our marriage and by the marriage. I mean, these really mean very much, they're practically synonyms, connubia and hymenaios, that we have begun. And Aeneas, in his response, yes, the other thing that Dido says is, she says, she talks about the name conjunx, and she says that given that this is all that remains of the name husband, so she's using a lot of marriage language. And when Aeneas replies, he says, "I never offered you the torches of marriage," and the way that he replies is extremely cold and legalistic, and Austen's commentary is, I think, very sort of acute on this. But because we don't really know what happened in the cave, and we have only this very sort of partial view of things, Virgil has if you like, calculatedly left in a very sort of open to he's made the Aeneid and he's made the story very 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 open to interpretation so that Dido can have her point of view and Aeneas can have his point of view. And really you might reasonably wonder what sort of a dalliance did a figure like Aeneas think that he was engaging in, and if he wasn't at liberty to stay or if he didn't think that he could stay, why did he go quite as far as he did? Obviously to the extent of a sexual relationship with Dido, because it's all right for commoners to do this sort of thing, but people who have such high status in, royal families or in mythology in general simply can't afford to have these kinds of dalliances and not follow through on them. So there are very good grounds for thinking that Dido, has every reason to believe that they're either married or heading for marriage. And this then raises the question of pietas, because we always think of Aeneas as loyal, and we think of pietas as this sort of concept that has three aspects: duty to your fatherland and duty to the gods and duty to your family. But it wouldn't be unreasonable if you read the story from Dido's point of view, and the story is told in a very sympathetic way from her point of view, and indeed even at one point the poet addresses her when he says, quid tibitum Dido cernenti talia sensus. What were your feelings then, Dido, as you beheld these things, meaning referring to the Trojans departing? So the narrative voice slips very much into a sympathy with Dido. And of course, she has so many speeches, and Aeneas only really has the one main direct speech. But it's clear, it's possible to read the story across books one and book four and to see Dido filled with hope. And this comes up in the conversation with Anna as well, filled with hope that Aeneas will actually put down roots in Carthage, and the settlement that she's building will be a sort of a twinned settlement of Trojans and Carthaginians together. And she somehow doesn't seem to get the message that Rome needs to be founded, even though this message is very, very strong in the stories that Aeneas tells about leaving behind Troy and the various prompts that he gets from the Penates in Book 3 and from Helenus in Book 3 and all the way through Book 3 that he has this divine mandate and mission to go and found Rome. And you can understand why Dido wouldn't take those points on board, because her perception has been addled by divine interference. So it's really in some ways a tragedy of points of view, and a tragedy of wounded dignity. Now, I think I've talked long enough, and I think I'd better leave it there. One of the things that Catherine said in our preliminary discussion yesterday was that the story isn't just a tragedy. So, Catherine, I really hope you'll come back to that point, because I'd like to hear more of your thoughts on that. If I did have twice as long to talk, I'd probably have said a few words about the clash between an Epicurean Dido and a Stoic Aeneas. Um, and I would have liked to have said something about the similes as well, because the similes in this book are really wonderful. And maybe last but not least, the poetry of the book is absolutely sublime. The description of Fama is wonderful. The beautiful scene when Mercury is flying down is wonderful. The falling city simile is wonderful. The description of night when Dido is troubled and she's imagining, she's thinking through all the various reasons she can't go on living. It's really very heartrending, and I think for pupils it's as important as anything else to bring out the magic of the poetry. So I'll stop there, and hopefully be able to say a few words later in the more general discussion.
That was wonderful. Thanks ever so much, Fiachra. And if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask at this point, please do raise your hand, unmute, or pop a question in the chat, and we can pick up with those now or a little bit later on through the webinar. Catherine, can I hand over to you at this point? And if we have any questions, then we can come back to those a little bit later on.
Hey, thank you. I am going to share my screen. Yeah, here we go. Right, hopefully, is that visible?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Excellent. Okay. So I've got the bit of this webinar focused on teaching Aeneid 4. And I very deliberately used the word teaching because teaching is slightly different from understanding. And the two are obviously connected. But for us as teachers, part of our headspace is understanding the text. And part of the headspace then is how we're going to teach the text. And I'm going to focus quite deliberately on strands or considerations connected to the process of teaching it. And then perhaps at the end we can come back to pull those two together, because of course what we understand about the text is going to play into it as well. So I wouldn't be at all surprised if everyone on this call was expecting me to open with something like this, because as teachers, when we think about teaching a text, we are sort of indoctrinated now to think that if we want to work out how to teach students to do well with this text, what we have to do is we have to look at the exam and we have to find out what the exam wants, and we need to make sure that our students then do that thing. So I am absolutely certain that every single person on this call will already have looked at the specification, what the exam board wants in terms of the lines that need to be covered, and will have looked at what's in Latin, what's in English. We'll know the paper breakdown across the A level, how many marks go for what percentage, and we'll probably not just have looked at those headlines from the specification, that will probably either already or at some point have gone deep into the mark schemes to think about how those marks play out on a granular basis. Okay, within those literature papers, in each paper of 75 marks, it's going to be 10 marks of translation, and then those comprehension short analysis questions are 15 marks, and then you've got the 15 marker for the longer analysis and the essay for 20 marks. And it's very natural as a teacher then to sort of start thinking, right, well, the answer for the translation and the answer for the comprehensions, those are fairly clear cut, but, a bit of a scratch of the head when it comes to the 15-mark close analysis question, and maybe even more of a scratch of the head when it comes to what does a good essay look like. And if we turn to the mark schemes, it's quite natural as a teacher to gravitate towards the top band of the mark scheme and think, right, what does a good answer look like? Because we all want to help our students do better and better. And maybe we look at things such as I put on the screen now, that, the top band for close analysis has to have very good engagement with the question. It's got to have a range of perceptive points with very good development, leading to convincing, I can't see it because a bit of my zoom's in the wrong place, leading to convincing conclusions based on a range of well-selected, accurate and precise examples, etc., etc. We might be looking at that sort of terminology and thinking, right, well, what does that actually look like on the page? In fact, I'm not going to talk much about any of that. And I'm not going to do it for two reasons. First of all, I'm not an OCR examiner. So it would be entirely disingenuous for me to suggest that I can guarantee that I've got nailed exactly what a good answer looks like, or indeed what the examiner who happens to be marking a script thinks a good answer looks like. Instead, I'm going to focus on this question. And I think as teachers, this is a question that's worth coming back to again and again and again. Because when I started teaching, all of my headspace was on, I need to work out what good looks like and help my students learn to do that thing. When I first started teaching, I absolutely was in the camp of, I'm going to try and chase the best answer from my students. But the longer that I've taught for, the more I've realised that a much more productive question is to think about removing barriers. Because if we pause and think not just about the ingredients in a good answer, but what are the habits or the tendencies that clutter up an answer and prevent it from being good, then we can actually teach in a way that's much more targeted. Because if we can help our students remove the barriers, what will happen is their progress will be much more assured. But if we only try and teach what a good answer looks like, and we don't remove the barriers along the way, we might have said again and again and again what a good answer looks like, but our students won't be able to get there because the barriers will still be in their way. So my main question for today has to be, what are the barriers? If we think our students are not producing answers as they should do on set texts, if they're not producing very good literary analysis, if they can't pull things together in a nice, pithy, well-argued, well-developed essay, what is holding them back? And I'm quite tempted, if I was doing this in person, I'd say, right, couple of minutes, everyone have a think, and you as teachers tell me what those barriers are. I'm still quite tempted to try and do that. And I'm tempted just to sit for kind of 2 minutes and say, put them in the chat. The slight kind of wariness is I've now done enough of these video calls to know that sometimes, not as much comes into the chat as would if you were in person. So I do have a list I can put on the slide, on the next slide if need be. But I am just going to pause and say, those of you on the call, take 2 minutes. And if you want to put into the chat what you think the main barriers to good literary analysis look like. 2 minutes. Right. So we have got some top material coming through on the chat, which I think everyone has access to. Is that right? Can we all see the chat? Yeah, excellent, excellent. And just to give a quick summary, we've had both barriers in terms of knowledge, not knowing the Latin well enough. We've had barriers in terms of structure, both structure within an essay, but also structure insofar as, is it actually structurally built on the question, a student's understanding and answering the actual question that's asked. And we've also got coming through this idea of confidence and fear of saying the wrong thing. So I'm going to go back onto screen share and I'm going to share my slides and put those together with some other possible barriers. And then what I'm going to focus on for the rest of this call is what could we do to help our students remove those barriers. So when I was thinking about this last night, my list of top barriers were as follows. Students who don't know the plot. And I say that really seriously because years ago, I remember teaching, it might even have been in Aeneid 4 actually, and because it was a book where there was so much to say and I was so excited about it, I felt like I was delivering my best teaching. But then at the end of term, last lesson of term, I said, let's do a quiz. And I thought I'd ask them some easy questions on plot. And it was such a kind of scales from the eyes moment because I realised that most people in my class, although we'd done all sorts of high level stuff on textual resonance and imagery and evoking different traditions, the basic plot of who the characters are, what they were doing and why, most people in the class didn't have a clue. And not knowing the plot is a huge, huge barrier for anything moving beyond the micro to the macro, as one of the comments in the chat was. If students don't know the plot, they can't go beyond the detail that's before them to anything that's interesting or connected with it. And they also can't analyse it in a way that feels interesting and meaningful because they're just stuck with the micro details, whatever that word is. Quoting, translating the wrong word is obviously a huge barrier because an answer that quotes or translates the wrong word is just going to not be able to get any marks at all. Not answering the question is definitely a huge barrier and often happens because students are trying to write the essay they thought they were going to write, as opposed to actually pausing, thinking for themselves and answering the question before them. Not writing enough, I would also say, is a barrier, not necessarily in terms of number of words, but not covering enough ground within those words, i.e. not moving through their material quickly enough to have a range of ideas within it. And then the final one, which I think connects very much with the confidence issue, is students who aren't clear enough, either in their writing or with their thinking. And if they're not clear enough, it's much harder for them to be confident that the thing they're saying is definitely worth saying. So I thought we'd take those barriers and we'd think about why do these barriers exist? And the first question has to be, how do students build their knowledge? And the second question has to be, as teachers, how do we talk about these texts in class? Because if we go into a bit more detail on this, when we're helping students to build their knowledge, what do we focus on in terms of how we test them or what we encourage them to give their attention to? Do we constantly test or remind the macro structures of the plot? Or do we as teachers sometimes get caught up in the word by word, teaching the detail, testing the detail, have you remembered why this is a subjunctive? Or do we keep coming back to not whether or not it's a subjunctive, but who's speaking why and what's going to happen next and what's happened just before? The next question, though, is perhaps even more interesting as teachers, because as a teacher, when we're talking about texts in class, it's interesting to think about how we do it. And I've put in yellow the sub-question, do we speak as succinctly as they need to write? Because one of the big barriers to writing clearly or with confidence is being able to handle a mode of expression which is sufficiently clear and straightforward to feel secure on the page and come out of that pen quickly. But when we talk about texts in class, particularly texts as interesting and interconnected as the Aeneid, it's very tempting in class to speak in a way that's much more verbose, much more rambling, much more kind of a bit here and a bit here and a bit there, then they're going to have to write. So my next slide deals with possible strategies, things that will help overcome some of those barriers. And I've put as the top bullet point, as teachers, what is the test schedule? And I am, although I am very, very alert and aware of the downside of the ever-present exam, and I'm very alert and aware of the danger of teaching to the test in terms of how much does that final exam come into the room. I'm also at the very same time very, very, very pro a robust weekly test schedule as a way of making sure that students are building knowledge. And if we're going to test every single week or however long you think is appropriate, I personally like to test every single week, partly because it takes the sting out of it and it makes it a regular part of the rhythm. But if we're going to test on a regular basis, what are we going to test? Are we routinely going to test knowledge of plot? Are we going to routinely test, e.g. understanding of literary terminology? Or are we just going to test translation? Because if we just test translation, it's worth being aware of the types of knowledge and understanding that we're not reinforcing and not building through that test schedule. The second thing, or the third thing I've put as a key strategy for success, is to be interested in distinguishing talking from writing and helping students realise that how we talk in class and how we write on the page might be a little bit different. But it can also mean, as a teacher, it can be helpful to think, are there ways in which you can shape your teaching and your talking in lessons in a way that's going to evoke the sort of pace and concision that students need to write with? And I had a very interesting time with an A-level class recently where I knew that a lot of them on the page had a sentence structure that's far too long. And if students write in a very long sentence structure, then they tend to get jumbled. They tend to be too slow in how they move through things. Their grip on the point that they want to make tends to be less good. And I thought, how am I going to get them to feel comfortable about writing sentences that are shorter and clearer? And I thought, actually, I need to start role modeling speaking in sentences that are shorter and clearer. And I started using the word full stop when I spoke quite a lot more to get them into the zone of thinking that actually they need to come to the end of a thought more quickly than sometimes they think. That takes me on to the idea of building concision. And the barriers to concision, the barriers to students writing clearly and efficiency and being able to move through a nice range of material, tends to be, first of all, sentence length, as I've said. But the second thing is sometimes students, I think, are very determined to either start with the literary effect or to start with the ultimate idea, rather than starting with a piece of content. And if you have students who are prone to write in a bit of a ramble, to teach them to start with a quotation, to quote and then comment, can be really, really good for their concision, partly because if they quote and then comment, what they will say has to be built exactly on that quotation, as opposed to saying something and then trying to shoehorn in a quotation that might not quite fit. It also makes it easier for them to feel the pacing of how they write, because if they quote and then comment, they can look at the pacing in their own writing and think, how often am I quoting? And if you're trying to get your students to up the pace with which they move through material, it's no bad thing to help them use physical space as a boundary for concision. And I have sometimes given my students, kind of essay sheets to write on, or literary analysis sheets to write on, with quite tight boxes, maybe the space of 2 lines of handwritten text. And I say to them, well, I want you to practice starting with the detail, saying something about it, and moving on. Start with the detail, saying something about it, and move on. Start with the detail, say something about it, and move on. And if students can get into that rhythm of start with the detail, say something about it, and move on, they'll find it much easier to find the concision, which then generates the range, which ultimately will allow for a good answer. In all of this, underpinning it might also be, as a teacher, the thought of, are we trying to generate really good answers by getting our students to say very complex things? Or are we trying to generate good answers by making sure students say enough, clear, and accurate things? And I've been preaching to trying to generate good answers by saying enough, clear, and accurate things. But if you're sitting on this call with a slight kind of niggle in your head and think, well, actually, if my students only ever write in short sentences, and if they, practice in this kind of like start with the details, say something sensible, move on, is it all going to be a bit too kind of like basic or the rest of it? My kind of final thoughts for you would be this: that if you want to help your students develop their sophistication of literary response, I would encourage you to think about helping them open up their range rather than overly increasing the complexity with what they say. Because when students try and chase a point that's overly complex, they often feel quite tentative about it. That confidence issue might come in. They often say it in a way that maybe isn't quite as clear as it could be. Sometimes it's a misfire, it's not properly locked onto the question. So for A-level in particular, if they want to increase their quality, I'd encourage you to aim for range, not necessarily complexity. And within that, what I'd also say is, for what it's worth, I think that great literature elucidates rather than simplifies. And what I mean by that is the power of a story as great as Aeneid 4 is not that anything fantastically complex is said at any one point in time, but an awful lot is said about love, and an awful lot is said about the human condition, and an awful lot is said about, e.g., agency and weakness. There's an awful lot of details, there's an awful lot of range within any of those ideas. So to help your students develop range, my kind of 3 suggestions for areas of focus would be as follows. First of all, to encourage your students to avoid interpretational silos. And what I mean by that is, if they think that this story is tragic, to say to them, right, well, actually, is there anything else? Is there only sadness in Aeneid Book 4? Or if they think of tragedy as something like, Dido is, the victim by the end of the book, is she only the victim, or is she also the aggressor? Are the tragic notes the only notes at play? Or if we think about what's going on with the divine characters, are there different sorts of notes at play when we look at that cast of characters? Is sorrow, sadness, horror the only focus of Virgil's poetry? Or is there also, for example, tremendous skills of literary prowess, partly there for its own sake, perhaps, as well? So if you feel that your students are getting into an interpretational silo where they're getting too stuck on the fact that, Dido is sad, Aeneas is bad, or whatever, encourage them to say, yes, but what else is there? And that will open up their thinking to be able to see more than one thing at once. Second kind of really, really good practice for developing literary analysis, I would say, is to encourage students always to try and move from the detail to the wider theme. If they notice there's a particular bit in the text they're interested in, then saying to them, so what? Aeneas is there bedecked in, his nice sort of jasper sword and whatever else he's wearing at that moment when Mercury swoops down. Oh, he looks a bit flash. Maybe we're a bit unimpressed. Maybe we think he's a bit selfish, okay? But whatever that detail is, what does that connect to? How do we view him, therefore, as a potential leader of the Roman race? What do we think about wealth? Are we pro-wealth? Are we anti-wealth? That kind of thing. And if they can move from the detail into a wider theme, you're helping your students open up the range of what they talk about because they're not just stuck on the micro the whole time. And then the final thing, which is very, very, very true of Virgil, as we've heard about so far, is to help your students be interested in resonance, because Virgil is so often evoking either other bits of his own text or other bits in the literary tradition or other bits of Roman history. And which bits of the text invite us to remember something else at the same time is such an interesting question for Virgil. And also as a teacher, if your students are looking at a bit and you say, does this remind you of anything else? Does this evoke anything else? You're also, as a teacher, strengthening your students' ability to synthesize their knowledge and pull strands together. And sometimes a kind of a metaphor that can be really helpful for students to help them get into the real kind of skill of Virgil's poetry is the idea of a chord of music. That a moment in a text is like a chord of music. Which notes are sounding at one and the same time? How many different notes? If something seems sad, is it only sad? If something seems unpleasant, is it only unpleasant? If something seems located in Carthage, is it only in Carthage, or is there also a resonance with Rome? If something seems evocative of the Greek tradition, is it only evocative of Greek and so on? And if you can help your students be interested in resonance, how one bit of a text connects with something else, then you'll really, really develop their skills to be able to speak in a way which is genuinely sophisticated because of what they're able to think about all at the same time, but doesn't drown in a trying to be overly complex about any one individual detail. So that is all I wanted to say because I think we need to have some time for questions. But I'm very happy if people want to ask some, what does this actually look like in an individual lesson? What would you do if you're doing kind of, this passage or whatever? I'm really happy to have questions thrown at me. If anyone would like to, I'll come off screen share.
You are welcome to unmute and ask a question directly, or you can pop something in the chat, whichever is better for you. But we've got plenty of time for questions. Vivian.
Yeah, just had a question about, I really, by the way, thank you to both speakers. What I've heard so far is fantastic to just sort of reiterate and get us new ideas as well about how to teach it, and also the references to the Greek plays, and it's fantastic. What I'm often struggling with is finding new ways to get the students really active in thinking and contributing in class. So what often happens in my lessons, I think, is that I try and get them, for example, to work in groups on different passages, each on different passages, and then they become a sort of expert in their own on that particular passage, and then they exchange ideas. But generally, it kind of sort of gravitates back to me, and I don't know. I'm finding it quite hard to make the students realize that their thoughts are sometimes really, really valuable, and just as valuable as mine. And as you were saying, it's open to interpretation, and it makes it really lovely to teach this literature, but also quite challenging because a lot of my students will just say, well, just tell me what it is. They just want to hear from the teacher. And before you know it, you're just sort of doing a bit of a lecture or something on it and saying and they just will write everything down that you say. And I really, about 2-3 years ago, I had a class and they were just amazing. And they started having discussions with each other and arguing with each other. And I stood back and I was thinking, this is what I want. Obviously I'm there to guide and maybe help them as well. But I find it at the moment, this year particularly, very hard to get them more involved. I don't know whether either of you has any ideas or suggestions for these sort of activating activities, these engaging activities.
I think there's kind of two distinct areas in that. I think the first area is the thing that holds students back from verbalizing their idea is either they don't know the text well enough to have an idea, That's kind of barrier one, and that's often quite a big barrier. And therefore, before students go and work on a passage, it's really, really helpful to make sure they can tell you the story first. Every lessons, I would say, needs to start with who are the characters, what's going on, why is this happening? Because if the story isn't clear in their minds, they can't engage with the detail. But the other barrier to students having their own ideas is if they think there's going to be a better idea coming up the pipeline later. And if they think you as the teacher are going to provide the better idea, it's really tempting just to sit back and think, well, I'll wait.
Yeah,
There's no
exactly.
point making my sort of inferior model. And that takes me back to my idea of think about how we talk about things in class. Because although I am very pro ambition, if at the early stage of introducing a text, the teacher deals with stuff that's very erudite, if as a teacher you front load with that at the start, you embed this idea of there's loads of stuff about this text that you, the students, don't know yet, which is going to be a barrier to your own ideas, which means there's a risk your students stay very underconfident all the way through. If the really interesting erudite stuff is held back as extension for where they've already got somewhere and then you push them forwards, then you don't put that barrier in. So at the early stage of teaching about text, I wouldn't say, dumb it down, but I would say talk about it on terms where their response and your response is on an equal footing. And with a text like Aeneid 4, tell the story, Aeneas does this, and then say to the class, give me a response. What do you think of Aeneas? If you were Dido right now, what would you think and why? And if your opening is engaging with it in a level where your knowledge is not relevant to that question, then you start to legitimize and encourage them to grow their own ideas. That's the first thing. The second thing I was going to talk about is this idea of you want them to be active in class. And I think it's obviously really important for students to be active. If they're active, they're just passive, they're not really learning. But it's also whether as a teacher kind of tapping into that and think, what actual activity do I want them to be doing? Because students can be active in all sorts of ways. They can be talking and they can look very active, and they could be like generating a load of ideas. But if those ideas are all kind of like guff and built on nothing, then also that's not necessarily valuable. And I would say in the early stages of teaching a text, the place where the students need to be most active is imaginatively active. Because one of the things that students find difficult is to get the text off the page. And I realized this several years ago when I was saying to a class, describe what you see. And I realized that turning words into sight is something which teenagers find really difficult because they very rarely have to turn words into sight because we have so much image everywhere that our mental faculties to turn a written description into a visual image are not necessarily developed. And if they can't see this story as if they were watching a film, then they cannot be imaginatively active with it because they'll only ever be hearing one note in that chord of music at a time. Because if they can't see the scene, then they're not going to be aware of the characters who are there who aren't speaking at the same time. Or they're not going to be aware of the framing that the colours give, for example, or they're not going to be aware of what they've just seen. So I think if you want to get your students to be more active, I would encourage getting them to kind of develop this imaginative activity of, at every single step of the way, say to them, what do you see? What do you hear? If you were a film director, what would you be showing us? And if you can get that text to live in their minds, you'll find the responses are right there. Because after all, if you said to them, give me a view on what happened on EastEnders last night, they'd all have a view. And the reason why they'd have a view, they probably don't watch EastEnders, but you know what I mean? Like they'd have a view because it's there in their minds. And the biggest barrier to having a view on Virgil is it's not in here as a living, breathing narrative, multidimensional. It's just there as a word they don't understand on the page.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you.
Could I come in on that as well? But I really enjoyed hearing your response, Catherine, and I'm going to take some of those tips into my own classes. I'm teaching Sophocles at the moment, and we did the scene in the Oedipus Rex last week where Jocasta it's Jocasta's last scene on stage, and Aeneas is sort of coming closer to finding out the answer, and Jocasta sort of figures it out before he does. And it just we did a performance of the scene, which is, let's say, about 100 lines or 150 lines. And it's not a very big group, it's about 15 people, and they were divided into three groups. A group of people who had workshopped the scene and had acted as advisors and directors, four students who were actors, and then the remaining students who were the sort of the fierce theatre critics, the butchers of Broadway, in the galleries of the West End, as it were. And this was a very it was a very fun class. And I sat at the back and I kind of let them do all the talking, but it made them embody the text and it made them enter the text to use Catherine's word, in an imaginative way. And I had given them fairly minimal guidance. I had told them that it'll rise or fall on their own efforts, but they had to go away and think about it, and they met separately. But I told them to think about what is it that motivates this character, what is the world from their point of view. And I think that if you're doing a narrative text from the Aeneid, you could do Jupiter, Mercury, Iarbas, Dido, Aeneas, Anna. There is scope there, and you could use that formula of the sort of the pre-production and the workshoppers and then the actors and then the critics, and that could be quite dynamic. Another possible format would be to think about storytelling, and I think storytelling in education is something that's been gaining ground recently, and there may be sort of videos, or it may be that your school would bring in a storyteller, but there's a sort of a renewed appreciation of how important stories are for how we live our lives. And maybe especially in this sort of very digital dominated age where attention spans are compromised and attention is fragmented and all that kind of thing. And we talk a lot about neurodivergence and so on. And storytelling can be a really spellbinding thing. And there may be ways in which you can use storytelling in the classroom that's sort of very much coming from them. And then another possible one, it would be debating. So different schools have different cultures, but I was teaching Augustan culture. Was it last year? I think it might have been. And for the last class, instead of talking about reception, which we could have done, and we could have talked about sort of fascist Italy and things like that, we had a debate that this house would restore the Republic, where I can't remember whether it was 4 or 5 characters on one side, and one of them was Cicero, and one of them was Varro, and one of them was and then on the other side, one of them was Augustus, and one of them was Livia, and one of them was, Velleius Paterculus, and they had to read the sources that were pertaining to the character in whose voice they were speaking, and enter it imaginatively from that way. And you can sort of take the story of Aeneid 4 and you can break it up into different points of view. You can talk about you could look at Venus and Juno. You could take Aeneas's prosecution for the defense, or prosecution, or cancel for the defense, or cancel for the prosecution, and sort of imaginatively devise some points of view and get them to think about it that way. And they might be just some of the most enjoyable sessions for the teacher as well as for the students,
Great, thank you. I did in fact one lesson. I did use the idea of a debate or a court, a law court, where half of the class had to defend Aeneas and half of the class was accusing it. There was and it was a very lively, and they really went into it. But they're brilliant ideas. Thank you. Storytelling and also the actual acting and the critics. That's great. I'd be interesting to hear if other people have tried it or will try it. It sounds great. Thank you.
The other kind of final thing possibly I might just add in is, again, thinking about barriers. If we want students to have their opinion, if we ask them to have an opinion on lots of things at once, it's harder for them to know where to start. So, by the end of 2 years, they need to have their own opinion on lots of things at once. But, when you're in those formative stages of building the confidence of their opinions, there is a value in getting them to engage with kind of much tighter questions than just, what do we think of Dido in general? And when I said in an earlier slide, start with the content, then build to the reaction, and then open up to the broader theme. In the early stages of teaching, it might just be a lot of start with the content, one bit of content, have a response, and then move on. Aeneas is, silent in this speech. How do we respond to that? Dido opens with perfida. What do we think about that word? And it's much easier for a student to have a response to something small and focused than it is to have a response to the big question. And I think the early stages of teaching are a mixture of making sure they know the big narrative as a structure, but what they're responding to are individual bits of content, and then gradually building up the range of how many bits of content they can talk about at once. But the basic skill of response is easier to train if it's react to this one bit, react to this bit, quick fire, give me a response, move on, give me a response, move on. And that will up their confidence as well.
Thank you.
Great, thanks, Vivian. Okay, we have one question in the chat, Catherine, that I will direct to you. How can you encourage resonance and also encourage students' ability to keep each point concise and move on?
Yeah, so I'd separate out the stages. The most important thing is the concise move on, right? Because if students are concise and move on, they're going to say a lot. And we all know for A level that if they say plenty, they're going to do fairly well, right? So that's the first one. So when I'm teaching students how to write, the first thing I deal with is concision. And actually, to help them deal with concision, often in the early stages, I don't ask them to write on literary technique at all. I just ask them to comment on content, quote a Latin detail, translate it, say something, move on. And we get the pacing of the move on, move on, move on established first. And then we start adding the other things in because it's much easier to lengthen a sentence than it is to shorten it. So if you've got students who are banging out, a page of discussion of a passage and in a page, they're dealing with the detail every other line. At that point, you can say, we've got the pacing, we've got the concision. Now let's actually build what we're doing with it. Let's get some literary techniques in there. And then with the students who are capable of it, then you can get them to say, right, okay, well, you've got all this stuff, rather than just doing, one, 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 let's think about grouping it around themes. So let's actually start organizing that material before you start. And then once you're dealing with themes, you can think about, well, actually, where are the moments where we can step beyond the text? But I would say Rome is not built in a day. And if you try and train all of these skills at once, what happens is the process feels more complex. And then you'll get the students fear how to start, they're not confident, they get a bit lost and so on. So train the basic stuff first and then gradually build it up because they don't need to be really sophisticated until the end. And if you spend the lower six or the first term or whatever, helping them realize that the bulk of really good understanding of a text is knowing the detail and saying something sensible about those details, not really kind of fancy, 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 whatever. If you get them kind of drilled in that, then they'll get a bedrock of confidence, which means that when you add in the much more sophisticated extension stuff, it will be genuinely extending as opposed to obfuscating.
Do we have any other questions for either of our presenters?
Can I jump in with a very, very self-invested plug then?
Sure.
Which I do feel a bit slightly ashamed, but then actually I think it needs to be said. The other thing that I found genuinely, honestly, truly, I mean, take this as you will, that I found has made a huge difference to the teaching of literature in the sixth form is how well students know the classical world. Because if a student comes to this text already knowing about Hannibal, already knowing about Augustus, already knowing about Mark Antony, already knowing about Greek tragedy, if they have that knowledge in place before they start the sixth form, their ability to engage with this text in a way that is multi-notes within the chord is going to be transformational. It's quite hard to teach that body of cultural knowledge fast in a kind of couple of introductory lessons at the start of the sixth form. And so the plug I would make is the thing that genuinely has made the biggest difference to, I think, what can be done in the sixth form teaching, just for me personally in the departments I've been in, is using a course book, which is really, really invested in hitting the high notes of cultural capital all the way through, which of course is De Romanis. So the hugely self-invested plug is to say that every single thing we've talked about so far in this call, including quite a lot of the Greek tragedy stuff that Fiachra was talking about, certainly all the Roman history stuff, it pops up somewhere in De Romanis books 1 to 3. For good reason, because the way we chose the content of those courses was designed to give the cultural capital the basis of what already needs to be in view before students come to a text. So that is my hugely, hugely self-invested plug.
Thank you, Catherine. Fiachra, I'm also going to come back to you because you mentioned something happening at UCL next week, which you did say at the start of the call, but I'm conscious that people have sort of joined the call since then. I can reshare the link in the chat if you'd be happy just to say a few words about what is happening.
Yes.
On the Aeneid next week.
So whenever a new translation of the Aeneid is published, it's always an event in sort of the history of the Aeneid scholarship and reception. And people may be familiar with the translations of Homer by Emily Wilson, first the Odyssey and then more recently the Iliad, and they got an awful lot of attention, very rightly, and they have modernizing touches. In the same series and published by the same publisher, Norton and Company, a New York publisher originally, this edition, this translation of the Aeneid has come out, and it's by Scott McGill and Susanna Wright. It's being billed as the first collaborative translation of the Aeneid ever, and that they have interesting things to say in the preface about their work, in their translator's note about their working method. But we're having a launch event at University College London in Bloomsbury on Gower Street on Monday the 8th of December. So it's 2 weeks ago. It's 2 weeks from 2 days ago, or it's in almost 2 weeks' time. So it's at 5 o'clock on Monday afternoon. If people are nearby and if they'd like to come, you can see the information on the under the link there that Gráine has recirculated. You don't need to register or anything. The room holds 70 people. So I hope that there will be plenty of room for anyone who would like to come, because it's difficult to get people to come to things these days, you know. Audiences haven't really recovered since the pandemic. I was teaching the Aeneid to a private reading group earlier this year in the spring, and I was asked, we were reading it in English, and I was asked what translation to recommend. And I went back to Mandelbaum, which is early 1970s, because I have a soft spot for Mandelbaum. I think he captures the melancholy very well. But then, while I was doing that, I knew that this was in the offing, and they sent me a copy, and they asked me to write a blurb for it. And I think that if this had already emerged when I was sort of starting to work on the Aeneid with that group of readers, I think I would have recommended this one, because it's very smooth and it's very fluent. It's very accurate, and it captures so much of what's in Virgil.
One final plug, this time it is from the CA. If you aren't already aware, the CA's podcast, it's called the Classics Podcast. Our current series is currently focused on the Aeneid. And there's a variety of episodes, some exploring characters, some exploring themes and techniques, and of course the rich literary heritage of the Aeneid as well. So you may like to listen to that yourself, or in fact share it with your students. It has been designed to be accessible to students. That leaves me just to thank Katharine and Fiachra for their presentations this afternoon. Thank you all for joining. We hope you found it useful.